The title of my presentation is Creating the Conditions for Positive Impact. And I deliberately use that phrasing because the idea that any of us can change anything by ourselves is a simplistic idea. The first one is what we call design thinking. And our CEO drew this diagram, and he says it's what his biggest regret was drawing this diagram because it oversimplifies the complexity of this particular theory. But the idea is that every time you design something, you always want to think about the people and how desirable the product is, the business, how viable and sustainable that business is going to be, and the technical issues, so how feasible it is, whether it's a hard product or a physical environment or a website or a social policy and a governmental policy. The idea is that you can use the process of design to solve any problem, the most intractable problems. And this guy, Tim Brown, was recently at Davos talking about these sorts of issues and how we can use design to start to think through these to come up with novel solutions. The magic of design thinking is that you always start with the people first. It doesn't mean that the other ones are not the same, it doesn't mean that they don't have the same value or importance, but that if you can figure out those subtle human behaviors to actually start to turn a little bit, you'll be the most successful with your design. The second thing is we really pride ourselves and use our network. So while IDEO is made up of 550 people, it's rooms like this around the world and connections that we make to Japan Society and JIDPO that actually are the things that sustain IDEO for 30 years and enable us to make great impact with the help of all the people that we connect with. And this is certainly true with the connections that we've made with Max and Casey as well. So the network is so important. Formerly, businesses can be conceived of as these very siloed entities, especially in the US. Design firms were very, very competitive, would never collaborate. But IDEO has a complete open source philosophy where we'll share how we did things, not only how we did things that were successes, but the things that were the most miserable failures are probably the most fun. Although you have to have a couple of glasses of wine to talk about those. And then the last one is, this is a diagram that was drawn by our founder when he was first starting IDEO. And he said, someone had asked him what the philosophy was and how we would decide what business we would take. And he said it didn't matter what the financial issues were, and that's certainly true now, the global recession, but you always have to balance money and what your heart wants you to do. And in fact, there's probably, to our own fault, there's probably more heart involved. There's a journalist once wrote that based on IDEO's portfolio and the things that we do, we are designers who are accidentally good business people. So I want to talk just generally about design now. As a designer, I'm a designer for 15 years and I run digital experiences at IDEO, but I also have designed a lot of products, a lot of environments. And I teach a lot of students of design, and oftentimes I find that students or just designers who are starting believe that they're in the business of designing objects. And we're not in the business of creating objects. We're actually in the business of creating consequences, because everything that we do has a consequence. And there's sort of this, in America, the iPod has become the shorthand for success. I actually had a client ask me for the iPod of diapers in a diaper design project. And so there's this tyranny of the iPod where people are constantly yearning for that next great thing without thinking about the consequences around what am I doing in bringing something new into the world like this. There's this great diagram that's by a guy named Bruce Mao, who's a wonderful designer, and he talks about this sort of continuous string of thinking when you're designing. And if you tug any one part of this string, it has an effect in the entire rest of the cycle. And too often, we forget that we have this sort of responsibility for all points of the cycle. And every time you tug on something, you're either giving up or giving away something else. And so there's a consideration around that. When we design, the negative impact of our design goes up over time. Many of us who design, especially if you're doing more strategic design, our zone of control is somewhere between ideation and design. And this is a very small, bounded area of our zone of control. But our zone of influence is actually much greater. And in fact, if you think about it, distribution and end of life are the two places where there's the most extreme negative impact. You can see how the arc goes up over time. And it's that zone of influence that we have to tap into if we're going to tackle the social and environmental issues that are so present in our global economy now. And if we do that, if we start to think about how we can not just be responsible for this small little part at the beginning of the cycle, but how we can be tapped into through our networks or through a consciousness and education, you can understand how we can actually really reduce that negative impact over time. But it's only when we know and understand the zone of our influence. We propose to think about sustainability as just one of the many things that designers have to think about. And one of the many things that we've evolved our profession into. Years ago, we were just focused on styling. And we gradually adopted the methodologies of design research, or what we call at IDEO human factors. We learned how to be good business people. We learned technology, whether it was mechanical engineering or software engineering. We learned to think about brands and organizational change. And in that same level, we need to be thinking about sustainability. Max sort of made this point before. We go from green design to design, and not wanting to highlight the difference of sustainable design, but actually wanting to just think about it on par with quality. I say social and environmental impact instead of sustainability or green design because it's actually a little bit different. When we define environmental impact, we think about climate change, and when we think about social impact, we think about inequality. For environmental impact, we think about conscious consumption, and social impact is more about empowerment. And environmental impact is about the planet, and social impact is about people. And so the marriage of these two terms really are what we call sustainability. However, sustainability is such a negative connotation. In the US now, people just think it's green, or they think it was just a marketing ploy. And similarly, I hope that through this conversation today and through the conversations we've had over the last few days, that we all feel that we're constantly learning and constantly seeing in a way that we can never go back to what we did even yesterday. Thank you.